Once national governments decide to do something about reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, and all signatories to the now in-force Paris Agreement have done just that, how do they go about actually reducing these emissions and meeting their targets? This is a particularly important question with climate change because so many of the activities that contribute to the problem are outside immediate government control. Greenhouse gas emissions are produced through personal individual choices like deciding to eat meat or drive a car. And businesses also make decisions all the time about how they produce and sell products or provide services. These decisions can also have a significant impact on the scale of greenhouse gas emissions. So governments have to find ways to meet their targets for emissions reduction through limiting actions that contribute to climate change. How do they do this? To meet targets, governments generally use regulation and economic instruments. Governments can and do apply regulatory standards around products and even infrastructure to help eliminate unnecessary emissions. Standards on the petrol we can use in cars or building code requirements fall into this category. But regulation doesn't necessarily drive down emissions, and it has limits. It'd be both expensive and controversial to go further than current regulation and use coercive powers like the police to stop people making bad environmental choices. So by and large, governments throughout the world have embraced the use of economic instruments to reduce emissions. This is the result of two key realities. First, one of the driving forces of environmental change generally is that the cost associated with that change, whether to health, long-term sustainability or disaster recovery, for example, has generally not been factored into the price we pay for products and services. While we pay for petrol to drive our cars or electricity to power our homes, this price has traditionally covered the cost borne by companies in extracting and providing this energy, plus whatever else they think they can charge to maximise their profits. Other environmental costs, what we call externalities, are excluded. Using economic instruments is therefore appealing because it involves incorporating these environmental costs into the prices we ultimately pay. The second key reality encouraging governments to focus on economic instruments is that this is something they're able to effect relatively efficiently. Increasing the taxation rate for carbon emissions, for example, is well within the power and resources of governments. Once the cost of engaging in activities that contribute to climate change increases, the argument goes, people and businesses will be less likely to engage in those activities, and as a result, greenhouse gas emissions will decrease. A few economic instruments have proven particularly popular. The first is a simple taxation model. Here, companies are taxed for emissions they produce, often just from energy production, with the expectation that this cost is passed on to consumers. This has usually been effective in driving down emissions and can even generate income for the government. However, because increased cost is ultimately borne by the consumer, it can be unpopular. The second model works the other way. It's a subsidies model in which governments provide financial incentives for companies to reduce their emissions. While more popular with companies, this model can be expensive for governments, and one criticism is that some recipients of government funding have been funded for activities they were planning to undertake anyway. In between this disincentive and incentive model, between the stick and the carrot, is an emissions trading model, one that usually involves a cap on emissions. Companies are allocated permits to allow them to produce a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions. If they risk going over this allowance, they can buy permits from other companies to allow them to produce more. Similarly, if companies are under their allocation, they can sell excess permits on to other companies. So this essentially involves both incentives and disincentives for action. It's proven a popular model internationally and has even been implemented across a range of countries in the case of the European Union. There are certainly critics of these models, beyond climate denialists, of course. Some have criticised the use of economic instruments generally, suggesting that relying on what has been the source of the climate crisis, the market, as a source of solutions to it is problematic, even perverse. Others, including political philosopher Robert Goodin, suggest that economic instruments usually mean that those wealthy enough to continue to destroy the environment, who can wear an extra cost for unsustainable practices, can continue to do so. These models, then, risk targeting the poorest members of society and/or the least profitable companies. And for prominent critics like Bjorn Lomborg, the scale of effort and investment involved in these instruments is above and beyond what the climate problem necessitates. They can involve opportunity costs in sufficiently responding to pressing problems like poverty or disease. Despite these concerns, both researchers and governments have generally endorsed or embraced economic instruments. For the research community, broadly speaking, a taxation or a cap-and-trade model is preferred, depending on the extent of taxation and the price placed on permits. So to what extent have these assessments informed the way governments have approached mitigation? The example of Australia is a telling, albeit somewhat depressing, illustration of the political challenges associated with mitigation policy. At different points in the last 10 years alone, Australian governments have outlined climate mitigation policies in line with all three of the different models I've just mentioned. A cap-and-trade model was embraced but never passed into law. A taxation model was legislated and implemented and then repealed, while an incentive model is currently in place. Does this reflect the success or efficiency of these models? Not at all. The taxation model in place between 2012 and 2014 was repealed even though it didn't have the damaging economic effects some suggested it would, and even though it was successful in driving down emissions from electricity generation. And the current incentive model, known as direct action, in place since 2014, finds little support in the research community. It's had minimal effect on business as usual emissions and has proven expensive for the government to maintain. Ultimately, the Australian government's embrace or rejection of these different models tells us less about their efficiency and more about the politics of climate mitigation policy. Shifts in public opinion, effective lobbying by industry groups, internal party politics, and the shifting fortunes of international cooperation are all more significant in accounting for Australian climate mitigation policy than the efficiency of different models in actually reducing emissions. Of course, the ideology of different governments has also been central. Conservative governments have generally emphasised the immediate cost of mitigation action, increasing electricity prices or jobs lost in the fossil fuel sector, for example. Centre-left governments, meanwhile, have been more likely to point to the costs of inaction, both in terms of the effects of climate change and increasing costs of transitioning to a low-carbon economy over time. Ultimately, Australia's experience tells us that politics can trump policy when it comes to climate mitigation. Clearly, countries like Australia need to transition away from fossil fuels, and the cost of doing so will only increase over time. But to date, different views of economic costs associated with action or inaction, and even a tendency to play politics with climate change, has undermined consistent and efficient policy on this issue. Australia's example is unique in some ways, but it does point to some of the challenges in ensuring that climate mitigation policy is efficient, effective, and long-term in orientation.